Yes.
And he was asked, he was talking about networks, and he was asked what does he think about terrorism. He said, you know what, terrorism is not a network. It is a strategy usually used by government, but sometimes used by private people too. You seem to suggest that sort of forming networks generate terror. Isn't sort of some independent networks that form sort of around radicalization to terror? Or is it some like larger, I don't know, maybe Muslim radicalism network that sometimes in some small chunks can sort of manifest it this way?
I'm not sure if I understand your question right. So Charles Tilly came here and said terrorism is a strategy. So strategy, not network. And are you asking me if I consider these networks to generate terrorism?
Yes, what do you think about it?
All right.
Is it a network or a strategy?
Yes.
And is it like a network around this strategy or just like much larger network that sometimes involves this?
All right. Terrorism is even worse than Al-Qaeda or democracy as concepts. I mean, it's so fuzzy and vague. I use it because it gets me in the front door of policy groups. Terrorism, of course, is a method. It's essentially being applied these days to the use by transnational actors for attacks against non-combatant civilians. That's the way most people sort of feel about it. It's actually a method like guns. I mean, there's nothing to it. There's no kind that's called terrorism. Anybody can be called a terrorist or freedom fighter or whatever. I'm talking specifically about a specific group, the Takfiri groups. Although there are very, very, very great similarities between how these groups form and human groups in general, be they spontaneous groups over the internet or gangs or drug cartels or our own political leadership. I mean, it's an old boys network and things like that. What I'm saying is that terrorism, the phenomena of Takfiri terrorism, the one that everybody's scared about but won't call that, Muslim terrorism or whatever for whatever reasons, that phenomena is based on two things. The kinds of ordinary networks that drive most of human behavior. And the most important predictive factors are just knowing the ordinary networks. Okay? Secondly, the friendship bit. Secondly is the cause, this sort of ideological factor that gives coherence to fraternity and camaraderie and friendship in a sort of eternal way and cause people to actually commit their lives to one another and die for one another. And that's a result of historical process of fairly recent origin that I've mentioned, the collapse of the Soviet Union being one. A very similar phenomena occurred between 1878 and 1914. And that was the anarchist movement. People thought that the anarchists, there was some central movement. Now, these were terrorists in the same way. They would blow up people. They would blow up themselves to blow up people. A lot of them were students, very well educated, middle class. They were quite successful in the havoc they wrought, much more than Al-Qaeda. I mean, they managed to kill the President of the United States, the Archduke of Austria to start World War I, Prime Minister of France, was it the Queen of Italy or Queen of Italy? About half a dozen top Russian ministers, caused havoc all over the world. Scotland Yard was set up, the Russian Okhrana, which became the precursor of the NKVD and the KGB. The Secret Service sort of split and became the FBI at the same time. All those result of the anarchist threat. Teddy Roosevelt, when he took over from McKinley, was assassinated by an anarchist, gave his first speech to Congress and said, look, this is very similar to George W. Bush's speech on September 19th. There is evil in the world. Okay, this is a battle against good and evil. You're for us or against us. And also gave himself the right for the United States for the first time in history to interfere in other places in the world in order to stop this evil act, which was the greatest threat against humanity at the time. It was only until the Warren Commission redid a study of the assassination of presidents that they decided, well, there really was no anarchist central after all. Okay? And it's very similar. Why did the anarchist movement disappear? Well, basically it disappeared because it was because of the war and because it was, kept going. They blew up things in New York. There was the Spanish Civil War. But it basically died out after World War I because the Bolshevists co-opted their support and their audience. Well, I don't think we should wait for someone like the Bolshevists to co-opt this. Marvel Comics is even better. But we should think about what kinds, and we can't predict this stuff, but we should start forming strategies about what can attract young people. Besides rave, okay? What can really move young people to find meaning in their lives? And Davos won't do it, right? Globalization isn't going to do it. That's for a bunch of wealthy people who schmooze in airport lounges and wealthy hotels and eat in 3-star restaurants and decides the world's going to be like them. For most of the world, globalization does not mean everybody's happier, healthier, and hippier. It means they're unmoored from their societies and their traditions, and they don't know where they are, and they're looking for where they are, and what is our society going to do to get these people sympathetic to us rather to that? And I don't see anything. Do you know the National Security Council, for example, which is the primary mechanism in the United States for forming foreign policy? Congress has no effect. None. Okay? The pundits have very little effect. It's the President and his National Security Council which decide foreign policy in the United States. There is not a single permanent representative from health or education or welfare or anything to do with actual human beings and their interactions on the National Security Council with permanent representation. Okay? It's mostly military, intelligence, and close association with economics. And so we're not getting the kinds of strategies we need to actually deal with the world as it is now. This is not a Soviet threat. This is not a battle against power blocks looking to position themselves for control of the world. This is an ideological battle, but one which is thoroughly integrated into notions of community and neighborhood and friendship, of people trying to find, again, a meaning in lives in a world where traditional relationships are being unmoored at an incredibly rapid pace.
Take one more question.
Yeah.
Is it possible that 911 and Al-Qaeda itself is a part of that frame?
What frame do you mean?
You said that some people create categories and they try to fit in all this.
Well, the question is 911 and Al-Qaeda part of a frame? It's part of lots of competing frames. I mean, we can describe all of human discourse, political discourse, in terms of frames, as Bob would say. The particular frame of Al-Qaeda, the historical frame of Al-Qaeda, is, I've talked about anarchism as sort of the model for understanding the social dynamics of it. The Nazi movement, I'm not saying these people are Nazis, I'm just talking about the movement. The Nazi movement is a good example of what Al-Qaeda is like, in the sense that it is a thoroughly modern movement, thoroughly modern, but it has atavistic cultural elements of a very peculiar kind. It is almost tribal in the sense that it wants to create a sense of deep community, of communitas, almost of collective effervescence. There are many sort of if you look at the poetry of it, of the ritual of it, you find the idea of trying to create a virtual community of people who can personally relate to one another at a very emotional level, not an intellectual level at all. And in that sense, it's a derivative of that movement. And let me. I don't know if I talked about it here. I don't think I did. So my last comment. Monotheism created the notion of humanity. Humanity didn't exist before monotheism. If you go to the jungles of New Guinea or even Egypt, which had a classification of different human kinds, there was no notion of humanity between monotheism. The secular monotheisms since the Enlightenment are monotheisms nonetheless. All the isms, the anarchisms, colonialism, fascism, communism, even democratic. And they try to save humanity. You see, that's their object. You can even find in Matthew, in the book of Matthew, Christ saying, you're either for us or against us. And so there was a division into humanity between those who should or could be saved and those who couldn't. And most of the clashes that have led to the greatest mass murders in human history are a result of the fact that one group wants to save humanity and there's another group that doesn't really want to be saved. And so they can be dumped in the garbage. And they fight back. And I think Al-Qaeda fits very well into this millennial tradition of monotheisms that are out to save humanity. And as such, it's an intrinsically violent movement, because all movements that try to save humanity will become violent, because there are lots of people who just don't want to be saved by that movement.
Okay, thank you very much. That was wonderful, and now we've got food and drink out in the hallway, and we can continue the conversation out there. Thank you very much.